Plain Jane by David Royce. Jane wanted to be more than just Jane. She envied the girls who had not one but two descriptors. Annabelle was Anne, Jasmine was Jazz, Stephanie was Steph. But she was just Jane, not shorthand for anything. She was average in every sense of that word. Brown hair parted in the middle that only extended to her shoulders. No highlights or extensions, just regular Jane hair. Brown eyes that would never be described as sparkly or shiny. She also had eczema, which made her skin appear scaly and flaky. Just a plain Jane. She was forgettable. A cardboard cutout in the background of a party, a cobweb in a hidden corner of a dark room, the crumbs forgotten on the bottom of a pizza box. Jane went unnoticed and unloved. Even as a child, she didn't receive the same praise as the other girls. Her parents would insist on taking her with them to parties at the neighbors, an opportunity for adults to day drink, masquerading as a social function. The adults would fawn over the other girls. Well, aren't you the prettiest thing? Oh, you're going to be a heartbreaker. She's as pretty as a peach. But when it came to Jane, they would always hesitate and fumble for something to say. Finally, blurting out what they felt was a compliment. You seem really smart. I bet you like to read. My niece was a tomboy also. Nothing wrong with that. They would say this as their parents kept a false smile plastered on their faces, eyes turning away as if in apology for whom they had birthed. In the social circle, girls were either beautiful or smart, never both. So Jane absorbed this knowledge, and it had shaped the life she now had. She had never married and only had a handful of fleeting romantic relationships in her 29 years. She was acutely aware of how her dates would glance to and fro, their eyes lingering a second too long on someone pretty, someone who shone, someone who stood out. Jane was not any of those things, and those relationships would soon fade away like fog before the rising sun. The days following yet another failed attempt at normalcy would always bring with them a depression that followed her every waking moment. Envy coiled inside like a snake, ready to strike, but no place to inject the venom. She wanted to experience the other side of living. She wished to be beautiful, wanted, desired by only one other person. Jane took solace in her work at the Turning Pages bookstore. Working nights after closing was where she felt like herself. She could never be one of those charismatic employees who helped customers, had interesting conversations about literature, who smiled like sharks and extended greetings when people walked in looking for something to read that would allow them to get lost in another world for a few hours. No, she was invisible, a shadow you saw in the periphery. Working after hours had its advantages, though. It was quiet, and she had the company of books with their freshly printed scent and incredible stories to tell her. Books didn't judge her, they didn't ignore her, and they willingly told her their tales with no hesitation or judgment. She would place these books in their appropriate places on the shelves, awaiting the day when they would be picked by a choosy customer. Bookstores were orphanages for stories, each one shivering in excitement when someone would caress their spines or gently pick it off the shelf amongst the others. They begged to be chosen and taken to their new home where they would be loved and cared for. Jane understood. She had no contact with the other employees except for Sarah Kinston. Sarah was the closest thing Jane had to a friend, even if she didn't understand why this was. Sarah was 23 with long flowing blonde hair that caught the rays of the sun and reflected them around her like a cape. Her blue eyes were crystal, and her skin as smooth and blemish-free like the finest of good china. People were pulled into her field just like a black hole sucked in any matter around it. Despite this, Sarah chose to hang out with Jane. Jane figured it was either out of pity or to make herself look even better in comparison. Not that it mattered to Jane if that was the case. She was happy to hang out with Sarah, even if she was mostly jealous of her friend's outward perfection. She often dreamed vividly of trading places for just a day with Sarah, getting to experience a world where people noticed her and shoved at each other for her attention. But Sarah seemed genuinely interested in Jane's well-being, treating her as an equal and always suggesting things to do to help get Jane out of her funk, as Sarah put it. One time, Sarah had suggested a complete makeover: haircut, makeup, new clothes, the whole thing. She even offered to pay. A girl's day out doing what girlfriends do, and Jane had reluctantly agreed. Despite having fun, nothing worked for Jane. Her hair did look good when she left the salon, and the makeup, Sarah insisted, really highlighted her best features, and the clothes were form-fitting and colorful. But after going home, she looked at herself in the mirror, and her brain screamed fraud. She attempted to style her hair as a stylist had done, with no success. Tufts of brown refused to stay in place and stuck up in the air no matter how she tried to smooth them down. She noticed her makeup, scrutinizing it, and decided it made her look more like a clown than a model, and her weird, disproportionate body never would surrender itself the way the clothes demanded. Sarah was disappointed when Jane went back to being the old plain Jane, never wearing the clothes or applying makeup again. Yet Sarah was still her friend, and tonight they were going out for a few drinks. The bar was just down the street from the bookstore, which meant other employees would probably be there as well. Jane stood contemplating which of her drab wardrobe to wear. She preferred muted browns and grays to better blend in. She didn't want to run the risk of people noticing her and introducing themselves without realizing that they knew each other already. This has happened before and was always embarrassing for the other person. They would apologize awkwardly before making an excuse to be somewhere else. The bar was called the Flying Tuna for some reasons unknown to Jane, but she arrived and headed inside, determined to at least have a good time with Sarah. The bouncer at the door never gave her a second glance as he stopped the people coming in behind her to ask for identification. The Flying Tuna was dimly lit with a horseshoe-shaped bar in the center and round wooden-top tables with metal legs surrounding it. A dance floor dominated the left-hand side with booths lined up along the right. It wasn't a fancy nightclub like downtown, but it had more charm and cleanliness than a typical dive bar which dotted the outer edges of the town near the industrial area. Inside, she saw Sarah, surrounded by men and women vying for her attention, willing to scratch and claw for an opportunity to be in her presence. Jane swallowed an envious flood of emotions and walked to the table. "Jane, I'm so glad you're here." Sarah stood and embraced her friend, ignoring the chaos that broke out beside her. Jane hugged her back. "I can't stay long. I have a thing tomorrow," Jane said. She didn't have a thing, not even a hint of a thing, but that would give her time to leave without offending her friend. "Bullshit, Jane. You're staying. Oh, let me introduce you to my other friends." Sarah spun her around. "This is Brandon, this is Camden, and this is Steph with a double F." Jane stared at them, not knowing what to say. Hello, everyone." She gave a half-hearted wave. They waved back and immediately turned their attention back to Sarah. Sarah ignored them and grabbed Jane's arm in a firm grip. "Drink this," she said while forcing a glass filled with amber liquid into Jane's hand. "You'll thank me later." Sarah winked. Jane looked at the shot warily but drank it. The liquid fire tore down her throat, releasing her from her embarrassment. "Oh, damn, that's something," she uttered. Sarah embraced her, whispering in her ear, "You haven't seen anything yet." Jane had a good time. She drank, she attempted to dance, looking like a fish gasping for air, and actually made small talk with people not generally in her wheelhouse. Sarah's friend, Camden, had talked to her for a while as if she was a normal person. All in all, a good night out. Thanks to Sarah. I'm leaving now, she said to Sarah. Thank you. The night had turned into the early morning, and Jane was drunk. She regretted the thought of going back to her lonely apartment. I'll walk you home, Sarah offered. She grabbed her jacket and finished off the remaining shot on the table. Later, Gators, she waved at her admirers. Jane and Sarah walked outside, the cold air turning their breath into fog that wafted behind them as they spoke. Ooh, I think Camden liked you, Sarah said. She pulled Jane into her grip. Jane was thankful for the darkness, her cheeks blushing. Camden had talked to her the entire night. He told her that he was finishing his doctorate and looking forward to his future in psychology. She had told him how she looked forward to being a manager at the Turning Pages bookstore. Jane would never be that, but thought it was something to say in the heat of the moment. He had smiled at her and wished her luck, as if it was as worthy as his pursuit. She always second-guessed herself and was embarrassed at how she had seemed to imply that the manager of a bookstore held the same esteem as a psychologist. But they walked arm in arm toward Jane's home as the lights from the city faded into the distance and made way for shadows and silence. You don't have to walk me home, Jane said. I'm sure you have to get home also. Sarah just pulled her closer. Don't be silly. I'll grab a taxi from your place, no biggie. They passed the gated fronts of stores and walked down deserted streets in silence. Everything in this part of town seemed so surreal at this time of the morning. During the day, there would be throngs of people and the sounds of trucks making deliveries, the banging and clattering of restaurants as they fed hungry patrons, and the muted conversations of business deals, arguments, and plans being made across cell phones everywhere. A bright neon rainbow ahead let them know that they weren't in some kind of apocalyptic event. A sign steadily buzzed above a small storefront that Jane had never noticed before. As they walked closer, they both glanced up, blinded temporarily by the gaudy colors. Madame Strovich, medium, tarot, read the glowing letters. Underneath in smaller print, your desires granted. Sarah stopped and looked at Jane in excitement. Oh my God, we have to go in. She was practically twitching. Jane, on the other hand, felt a revulsion. Her body stiffened and mouth went dry. I just want to go home, Sarah. These places are for tourists. Come on. She attempted to pull Sarah away, but the other woman didn't budge. What are you talking about? This is so random and perfect. I want to get my fortune told. Please, it'll take like 10 minutes. Please. Sarah laced her fingers together and placed them on her chest, as in supplication, her eyes pleading. Jane didn't want to, but she did have a fairly great time, thanks to Sarah. How could she deny her this one thing? So instead of listening to her inner voice, she smiled at Sarah. Okay, but make it quick. Sarah jumped and clapped her hands together before dragging Jane through the door. As they passed through the barely lit entry, Jane shuddered. The night was cold, but this was something else, a foreboding that penetrated her mind. The interior was what you would expect from a place like this. Gypsy decor dominated the room. Red curtains hung from the windows. A plastic table sat in the center with a dolly spread across. An obviously store-bought crystal ball in the center, and shelves lined with various herbs, dirt, and other indistinguishable things aligned along the wall. Sarah gasped in amazement. Jane scrunched her nose. What is that? There was a scent, unpleasant and drifting. It is protection, a voice rang out. Both of them turned their heads. A woman appeared out of the shadows. Her eyes were blazing. She had a pointed chin and a nose so crooked and elongated that at first Jane took it as a witch's mask. Her head was wrapped in a scarf which trailed down her back. Bracelets and rings adorned her fingers and wrists. She might have been 70 years old or 100. The woman was hunched over, her back long gone, and slowly made her way into the main room with help from her cane. She slowly approached Jane and Sarah. "So what is it that I can offer you today?" Her voice sounded European, but neither woman could be sure. Jane felt a twinge of guilt for being here. The old woman was obviously not in shape, and she felt bad for rousing her in the early morning like this. Sarah didn't have any such feelings and gave the woman her patented smile in return. "I'd like my fortune read," she said with delight as they both took a seat. "I want to know about my future husband, who better be rich, and the life I'm going to have. Oh, and also, if I have any kids, are they going to be girls or boys? I can start getting a color scheme situated." Sarah was being friendly, but this often came off as sarcastic. Jane kicked her under the table, but Sarah just looked at her and mouthed, "What?" The old woman shuffled forward and pulled a third chair from the table. She slowly relaxed into it, setting her cane aside and placing her hands on the table, palms down. She observed Jane and Sarah for an uncomfortable amount of time. Jane actually thought she was going to kick them out and tell them to never come back. Sarah just sat there with her smile plastered on her face while Jane nervously kneaded her fingers, which she kept in her lap and out of sight. Her expression was meant to be neutral, but looked more like a grimace. "My name is Sylvia Strovich. I'm from Russia and elsewhere. I have the sight and grant desires." The woman finally broke the silence. Was this an introduction? Were they supposed to respond? Sarah and Jane glanced at each other. Sarah opened her mouth to say something, but Sylvia slapped both palms hard on the table, and the girls jumped at the sudden noise. "I take cash and credit card, no funny stuff. You no like reading, you no refund. I only tell truth." Sarah's smile faltered, and she started to rise from her chair. She wasn't used to being talked to like this. People followed her, and she led. That's the way it had always been. Something in Jane made her say something, almost against her will. She wasn't the assertive type, happy to just go along, but she wanted to stay and hear Sylvia out at least. She reached for her purse beside the chair to see how much money she had on her. Sylvia grasped her wrist. The older woman's hand was cold and clammy like a piece of parchment slicked with oil. "We get to payment later is no problem for Sylvia Strovich," the woman said. Jane looked in her eyes and felt a connection. Sylvia's eyes were green halos with all of her desires held within. Sylvia abruptly looked away and clapped her hands together. "But first we had tea, yes? Relax and have, girl talk." She reached inside of her shawl and brought out a small brass bell. It rang out, and from the shadows in the back of the building, another figure shuffled out. Jane had a hard time putting this person into focus. They were fuzzy and made of smoke. At least that's what her mind said. They set down a cup of tea in front of both Sarah and Jane before walking backward into the dark again. Jane tentatively picked up her cup and sniffed. There were no suspicious smells, so she went to take a little sip. Sylvia's hand pushed up on the bottom of the cup. "Drink all you must drink to have your desires, child." Jane found herself taking the entire cup in one drink. She swallowed and looked over at Sarah. She was also drinking the tea as if it were a shot at the bar. They both placed the cups on the table, waiting to see what was going to happen next. "Just know, only one desire will be granted." Sylvia's hands were clasped in front of her chest, and a smile spread across her face. Her wrinkles seemed to be dainty tendrils spreading from her forehead to jowl. She placed her palms back on the table and said, "Now we start ceremony. What is your desire, child?" She stared at Jane, but it took a minute for Jane to realize that she was the one being addressed. She was always the one ignored. The lonely, the unnoticed one, the invisible one. The one who never got promoted, never got a boyfriend, and never had a chance to be anything other than someone's layover on the way to a better life. Anger rose in Jane's chest as she thought about all the time she was banished to the lower levels of existence, treated like vermin. No, less than vermin. Because there were people she knew who loved and cared for their rats and insects and snakes, yet never gave her the time of day. She didn't qualify as worthy to the level of a rat. Her eyes were drooping, her vision blurring at the edges as she thought about the injustice of it all. All she wanted was to be the popular one, the one you went out with because you wanted to and not out of obligation or pity. Her eyelids fluttered under what felt like a weight. She looked to Sarah, who appeared to be sleeping, her chin resting on her chest with a long, thin line of drool seeping from the corner of her mouth. Jane turned her head to look for Sylvia, but she only saw a mist in the place Sylvia Strovich had been just seconds ago. She allowed her eyes to rest, and the blackness overtook her. Jane woke up in a pile of lumber and dust. The morning sun blazed through a plate glass window, penetrating her eyes and causing her to squint against the intrusiveness. She slowly stood up, the smell of sawdust and dirt heavy in the air. Where am I? She thought. Looking around, she noticed a table covered with grime and tools. She rubbed the top of the table. This was Sylvia's place. This was her table. Jane remembered the night before. Her and Sarah had stopped in after leaving the bar asking for a reading. But there was no sign of Sarah or Sylvia. The place was clearly under construction, and somehow Jane had passed out in the middle of it. The room was in shambles, obviously in the midst of being refurbished. She went to hold her head in the side of her palm, but quickly put her hand down when she felt what was there. Circling around, she saw pieces of a broken mirror laying on the ground. She walked over and picked up the largest piece she could find. She was looking at another woman. Her hair, which she had felt, was luxurious and full, auburn waves cascading beyond her shoulders and shining like crystals in the morning light. Her eyes were like emeralds, two green pools of gems, and her skin, oh, her skin. It was smooth, blemish-free, and shone like a star in the night sky. Her chin was less protrusive, and even her nose was just slightly angled, but in a good way. Jane was finally beautiful. She stepped from the rubble and through the open door. Crowds were out in full force, weaving to and fro on the sidewalk, unwilling to give up any space for someone else. Jane hugged herself, as usual, and was hesitant to join the fray. A man smiled at her, then another, and then a woman gave her not only a smile, but a wave. She reciprocated and took a step into life, a step into popularity, and a step into her new skin. As she twirled in her new freedom, away from what she had been, a woman bumped into her, almost causing them both to fall. Jane steadied herself and grabbed the other woman at the same time, something she would never have been coordinated enough to do previously. Jane swung around to see if the woman was okay. She had dirty hair hanging over her eyes, her hands were calloused, and she had dirt and grit underneath her nails. Her eyes stared at the ground. I'm sorry, the woman muttered. Her head hung low, and she recoiled from Jane as if expecting a punishment for bumping into her. Jane grabbed the woman's arms. It's okay. Hey, look at me. What's your name? Sarah's eyes slowly raised to meet Jane's. At first glance, Jane saw fear, but that quickly turned to anger. Sarah went from docile to aggressive and tried to claw at Jane's face. You fucking bitch! I'll rip that face right off you, you goddamn cunt! She yelled. People stopped their daily routine and took notice. Nobody intervened, of course, but this was something they could talk about later in front of their water coolers at work. Jane tried to fend her off, eventually pulling them both back into the building. They rolled around on the floor, Sarah scratching and clawing at Jane's face, Jane trying desperately to grab Sarah's wrists to stop the assault. They rolled around among the 2x4s and plywood until they were both winded. Each collapsed in a heap, laying side by side while catching their breath. I didn't know, Jane eventually said. I just wanted to be like you. Sarah breathed heavily beside her. I know, she said. And you got what you wanted. Your desires granted. So why are you so angry at me? Jane asked. Sarah let out a laugh, which sounded like a groan. Because it made me into this. She spread her arms over herself. Jane saw a woman who was beaten from life. Dirty, stringy hair, dirt encrusted on her face, and clothes that had seen better days. The price. Sylvia said there would be a price to pay, but I swear, I never thought it would be this, Jane said. They looked at each other. The tension lifted as Sarah got to her feet and held a hand out to Jane. Jane accepted, and they stayed there for a moment, brushing bits of wood and sawdust from their clothes and hair. So what do we do now? Sarah asked. Jane thought about it for a minute before answering. I guess we just get on with our lives. Jane smiled at her. Sarah examined herself, but finally returned the smile. We're still besties, right? Sarah asked. Jane hugged her tight and answered, Of course. Always. Sarah's eyes went wide, and she let out a whimper as she collapsed to the floor. She put her hand on the small of her back, and it came back stained with fresh blood. Jane stood over her, her hand grasped around a 6-inch piece of broken glass. Sarah's eyes searched for answers in Jane's, but none were found. Jane lunged and stuck the glass again and again and again into the prone flesh of Sarah. Just know, only one desire will be granted, she hissed as she watched the light fade from her friend's eyes. Exhausted and covered in blood, Jane slunk out of the back of the building towards her home. The voice of Sylvia whispered in her ear, You have paid the price. Desire is granted, child. The end.